Some Bible scholars have claimed we can't even be sure Jesus of Nazareth existed.
I mean, one thing we need to keep in mind is, for us, the Bible and Jesus is a very important person. In the first century, Judea was a backwater Roman province. Nothing important happened there. They sent minor officials to govern it. It really had not much consequence to the Roman Empire, and no one really knew much of what was going on in Judea. They tried to just keep it quiet. So to have any evidence of any historical figure is quite striking. In fact, Pilate, it was only recently that we had external evidence of Pilate himself, and we now know that he actually existed in the dates of his rule and things like this. So when there's a claim that, well, we don't have any evidence of Jesus, it's actually kind of what we would expect. On the other hand, we do have rather significant textual evidence of references to Jesus pretty early on from non-Christian, non-Jewish sources. So for example, two Roman historians, Suetonius and Tacitus, who are both writing in the early 2nd century based on their research, talk about Nero, Emperor Nero, in 64, persecuting the Christians. Now in Suetonius it's kind of a quick reference, but in Tacitus you have the long description that you're probably familiar with of Christians being thrown to the lions, of burning Christians, of crucifixions of Christians, that Nero wanted to pass off blame for the fire in Rome, the Great Fire, and so he blamed the Christians. So you have, within 30 years of Jesus' death, a reference to people who are followers of this Christ, and is pretty good evidence of some knowledge of this person. The second piece of evidence is from Pliny the Younger, who was a governor in Bithynia in Asia Minor after 110. And we have preserved from him a number of letters about various topics, one of which mentions the problem of the Christians, as he saw it a problem. So these Christians would gather together and they'd worship what he called Christ, and even references they'd worship Christ as a god. So you have evidence that in the early 2nd century they're worshiping this Christ as a divine being, and they're doing all the things we would expect early Christians to do. They're teaching, they're talking about the 10 Commandments, they're having a meal, they're celebrating the Lord's Supper. So granted, this is 50 years later, but it is a further reference to Christians outside the New Testament.
If the Gospels are deemed unreliable based upon this external evidence test, then our entire knowledge of the ancient world, such as Plato, Aristotle, Caesar, will crumble, because no source compares to the best attested works of antiquity, the Gospels. Dr. Randall Price is a world-renowned archaeologist, author, and college professor. Since 2002, he has served as the director of excavations at the Qumran site, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947. The Dead Sea Scrolls refer to a large collection of biblical and other texts from around the time of Christ.
Whether we talk about the autographs, which are the original versions of the Bible, or the apographs, those copies made from it, we are talking about books that were scrolls originally, written on the type of materials that were available in the ancient world. These would have been leather, a type of material that would have been made from the skins of animals, or parchment, which is prepared leather, and then would have been written with ink made from soot that's mixed with vegetable gum. Now, when we look at the book of Jeremiah, chapter 36, there it describes the process of writing. And it says that Baruch, who was Jeremiah's scribe, wrote on a type of material that was then cut up by King Jehoiakim and thrown into the fire. So it had to be something easily cut and that was burned. We believe that the material that was used more frequently was something called papyrus, made of the plant matter, originally from Egypt, but then also available in Israel itself. And this would have been extremely delicate, wouldn't have been preserved well, but would have been easily to write upon, and probably the most common thing used for the composition of biblical books.
Job is an interesting book, likely the oldest book in the Bible, written about 1500 BC. The last book of the Old Testament to be written was likely the Book of Malachi, which was written somewhere around 400 BC. During those 1100 years, these documents had to be copied over and over to preserve the content. Just how was that copying done to ensure accuracy? Joel Lampe, manager and curator of the Bible Museum in Goodyear, Arizona.
Skeptics have pointed out that the oldest existing copies of the Old Testament date some 1,500 years after the original writing. They assume that given the great amount of time between the original document and the oldest copy, there must be hundreds, if not thousands, of errors in the text of the Old Testament. We don't know the exact process used during the Old Testament period for preserving the scriptures. However, it is important to understand that the copying methods used in reproducing the Bible were astounding in their accuracy. The Hebrew word for scribe is sofer. Its root meaning is to count. And what did they count? We know that around the 7th century, a group of scribes called the Masoretes had to copy the original page with such exactness that the number of words on a page could not be changed. If the original page had 288 words, for instance, then the page being copied had to have the same 288 words. Each line on a new page had to be the exact same as the line on the old page. If the first line on the original page had 9 words, the first line of the copy page had to have 9 words. After a page was copied, the number of letters on that page was counted and compared with the original, and then another scribe would check to see what the middle letter was on the copy and the original. The scribes were not allowed to copy sentence for sentence or even word for word. They had to copy letter for letter. After a page was copied and checked by another, still a third person would check to see what the middle word was on the page. Then, when the whole book was finished, another would count the phrases. And what I'm about to show you here, very few people outside of Jerusalem ever get the opportunity to hold, study, examine with their own eyes an original, on sheepskin, biblical Dead Sea Scroll fragment. That's from the book of Daniel. It dates to 125 BC.